You're sitting at the kitchen table running the numbers for the third time this month. Your parents bought their first house in 1972 for $21,000. Your dad was making $11,000 a year as an electrician. That house cost less than twice his annual salary. You just got pre-approved for a mortgage. The median home in your area is $410,000. You make $68,000 a year. That house costs 6 times your annual salary. Your parents paid off their mortgage in 18 years. You're looking at 30 years minimum. Something doesn't add up. Actually, it adds up perfectly. You're just looking at the wrong numbers. My name is Alex, and for the past 12 years, I've been obsessing over why the financial math that worked for your grandparents completely collapsed for your generation. And if this breakdown changes how you think about building real wealth, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Here's what everyone's talking about. Housing prices went up 1671% since 1970. Wages didn't keep pace. The American dream is broken. Homeownership is dying. That's the story you've heard 1,000 times. But here's what nobody mentions. While everyone was watching housing prices explode, farmland quietly appreciated 2,119% over the exact same period. That's 450 percentage points higher than housing. The asset nobody talks about outperformed the asset everyone obsesses over. And the reason why reveals something fundamental about how wealth actually works in America. Now, before you tune out thinking this is some farming channel, stay with me. Because what happened to farmland versus housing over the past 55 years explains exactly why your salary feels like it buys less every year, why your parents could afford a house on a single income while you're struggling with two, and why the traditional wealth building advice you've been following might be steering you in completely the wrong direction. The real story isn't just about housing getting expensive. It's about which assets actually preserve purchasing power when the entire monetary system changed. And that change happened in 1971. Let's rewind. In 1970, the median home price in America was $23,400 according to the Census Bureau. The average acre of United States farm real estate was $196 according to the USDA. Fast forward to 2025, that median home is now $414,400. That farmland acre is $4,350. On the surface, both went up dramatically. But here's where it gets interesting. That's not the number that matters. The number that matters is the ratio. In 1970, a typical new home cost 3.2 times the median household income. By 2022, according to Visual Capitalist's analysis of housing affordability, that ratio hit an all-time high of 5.83 times median income. In 2025, it's still above 5 times. Housing didn't just get more expensive in absolute terms. It absorbed a larger portion of household wealth while wages stagnated. You're not imagining it. The math actually changed. Your parents needed 3 years of household income to buy a house. You need 6. That's not inflation. That's a structural shift in how wealth flows in the economy. But here's what makes this even more revealing. When you adjust for inflation, the story gets darker. The 1970 median home value of $17,000, using Census Bureau data for existing homes, equals about $65,300 in $2,000 terms. By 2000, the actual median home value was $119,600. Real home prices nearly doubled even after accounting for inflation. Housing genuinely became more expensive relative to everything else. That's not a perception problem. That's math. Now let's look at farmland through the same lens. In 1970, inflation-adjusted farm real estate value was $519 per acre in 2023 dollars, according to the USDA Economic Research Service. By 2023, the real value was $1,364 per acre. That's a 163% real increase, still significant. But here's the critical difference. Farmland did that with fundamentally different volatility patterns. And those patterns tell you everything about which asset actually preserved wealth versus which asset became a speculative playground. What I'm about to show you next is the thing that took me years of digging through USDA reports and Federal Reserve data to understand. Because the story everyone tells about housing and wealth building is missing the most important chapter. The chapter about what happened when America abandoned the gold standard. From 1970 to 1980, farmland values rose from $196 to $737 per acre. That's a yearly average increase exceeding 10%. The University of Kentucky Agricultural Economics Analysis attributes this to strong farm commodity prices, expanding international trade, high inflation across all asset classes, and pure speculation. Farmers were buying land they couldn't afford because everyone believed prices would keep rising forever. Sound familiar? It should, because housing did the exact same thing 30 years later. Then came the 1980s farm crisis. Farmland dropped 25% between 1984 and 1987, falling from $801 to $599 per acre. The USDA documented this collapse in brutal detail. Farmers who had borrowed against inflated land values during the boom went bankrupt. Small towns across the Midwest hollowed out. Generational farms were auctioned off. It was devastating. But here's what matters. Farmland recovered, and then it stabilized. The speculative fever broke. And what emerged was an asset class that appreciated steadily based on actual agricultural productivity rather than fantasy projections about eternal growth. Housing experienced its own crisis in 2008, but the dynamics differ fundamentally. And this is where we need to talk about what really drives asset prices. Because it's not what you think. Housing peaked at a median of $329,000 in Q1 of 2020, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Then COVID hit. And something unprecedented happened. The housing market didn't crash, it exploded. By Q4 of 2022, the median hit $479,500. That's a 46% increase in less than 3 years. The National Association of Realtors called it among the fastest price increases in United States history. But unlike the 2000s housing bubble, which was driven by subprime lending and financial engineering, this surge was driven by something different. A combination of record low interest rates, a sudden shift to remote work expanding where people could live, and most importantly, a massive increase in the money supply. The Federal Reserve printed more money between 2020 and 2022 than it had in the previous century. And all that money had to go somewhere. Housing absorbed a huge portion of it. If you've made it this far, you're already ahead of 90% of people who've never questioned why housing feels impossible to afford. But don't stop now. Because what comes next explains why some assets protect you from monetary inflation, while others just ride the wave without actually preserving your purchasing power. Meanwhile, farmland has been steadier. Since 2000, nominal farmland values increased an average of 6.0% per year, according to the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service. Even accounting for inflation, land values increased 3.5% per year on average. That's real wealth preservation, not just nominal price increases that match inflation. Actual purchasing power growth. And that matters more than you realize. The USDA reports that farm real estate, meaning land and structures, now accounts for $3.67 trillion, representing 83.6% of total United States farm assets. Think about that ratio. In farming, the land is the wealth. The equipment depreciates. The buildings need maintenance. But the land, if managed properly, appreciates consistently over decades. It's the ultimate long-term wealth preservation vehicle. And it's done that job better than housing over the past 55 years. By state, values vary dramatically. In 2025, pastureland averaged $1,920 per acre nationally, while cropland averaged $5,830. The Pacific region saw cropland at $9,830 per acre, more than 4 times higher than its pastureland value of $2,450. Location matters enormously, just like housing. But here's the difference. Farmland location is tied to agricultural productivity, soil quality, water access, growing season length. Housing location is often tied to speculation about future development, school district rankings, and proximity to job centers that might not exist in 10 years if companies keep embracing remote work. Regional premiums in housing mirror this pattern. Hawaii's median home value is $977,538, according to recent census data. West Virginia's is $170,514. The same asset class. Wildly different prices based on location. But with farmland, the location premium is based on something tangible. Iowa cropland costs more than Montana pastureland because Iowa soil produces more bushels of corn per acre. The price reflects actual productive capacity. Housing prices often reflect vibes and speculation rather than fundamental value. So here's the fundamental question for anyone trying to build wealth. Which asset better preserved purchasing power over the long term? Because that's what matters, not which asset went up more in nominal terms, but but which asset actually protected you from the devaluation of the currency itself. Since 1971, when President Nixon ended the gold standard and the dollar became purely fiat currency backed by nothing but government decree, the United States dollar has lost over 87% of its purchasing power, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index data. A 1971 dollar now buys less than 13 cents worth of goods. Let that sink in for a second. The currency you earn your salary in has lost almost 90% of its value in just over 50 years. Housing appreciated 1,671% since 1970. Farmland appreciated 2,119%. Both outpaced inflation. Both preserved purchasing power better than holding cash. But farmland did so with less volatility, fewer speculative bubbles, and without requiring you to live in it. You can't live in an acre of Iowa corn. But you also can't get foreclosed on if you lose your job, because farmland doesn't come with a mortgage payment unless you choose to leverage it. Housing requires ongoing payments. Property taxes, maintenance, insurance, homeowners association fees if you're unlucky. Farmland requires management, sure, but it's a productive asset that generates income through crop yields or grazing leases. Housing is a consumption asset that you live in. The financial dynamics are completely different. Now we're getting to the real stuff. Because the question isn't just why farmland outperformed housing. The question is why nobody talks about it, and the answer reveals something uncomfortable about how wealth narratives work in America. Housing gets all the attention because everyone needs a place to live. The real estate industry is massive. Realtors, mortgage brokers, home builders, renovation shows on cable television. There's an entire cultural apparatus built around the idea that home ownership equals success and wealth building. And look, I'm not saying home ownership is bad. It's not. For many people, owning a home is both a quality of life improvement and a reasonable wealth building strategy. But the narrative that home ownership is the primary or only path to wealth for ordinary Americans is incomplete. And it's incomplete in a way that benefits the financial industry more than it benefits you. Farmland doesn't have that narrative apparatus. There's no farmland equivalent of House Hunters International. You can't get a 30-year mortgage at 3% interest to buy cropland unless you're an actual farmer with proven agricultural income. The barriers to entry are higher. The cultural story is absent. And because of that, it stays off most people's radar completely. But here's what the data shows. Institutional investors know about farmland. Bill Gates is now the largest private farmland owner in America. Pension funds and endowments have been quietly allocating to farmland for decades because the return profile is attractive, and the correlation to stock market volatility is low. The smart money has known this forever. They just don't advertise it. This is the part where most people check out. Don't be most people. Because what I'm about to explain is why this pattern exists, and why understanding it changes everything about how you think about assets and wealth preservation. The real magic happens in your brain, specifically in how you've been conditioned to think about wealth building. You've been taught that you need to work a job, save money, buy a house, and retire with a paid-off home and maybe some retirement accounts if you're disciplined. That's the script. And for people born before 1970, that script actually worked pretty well. The math supported it. Housing prices appreciated steadily but not explosively. Wages kept pace with cost of living increases. Pensions were common. Social Security was solvent. The entire structure worked. Then 1971 happened. Nixon closed the gold window. The dollar became pure fiat currency. And everything changed. The money supply could now expand infinitely. And it did. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet has exploded from under $1 trillion in 2007 to over $8 trillion at its peak in 2022. All that new money flowing into the economy doesn't affect all prices equally. It affects asset prices first. Stocks, real estate, farmland, commodities. The things that wealthy people own. Consumer goods prices rise more slowly. Wages rise even more slowly. And what you get is exactly what we have now. Asset price inflation that benefits asset owners, while wage earners see their purchasing power eroded year after year. Housing appreciated 1,671%. Your salary didn't. That's the gap. That's why your parents could afford a house and you can't. Not because you're financially irresponsible, or because you buy too much avocado toast, but because the monetary system fundamentally changed in a way that rewards asset ownership over labor income. And if you don't own assets that appreciate faster than currency devalues, you fall behind permanently. Farmland appreciated 2,119% because it's a productive real asset with inelastic demand. People need food. The amount of arable land is finite. Population grows. Therefore, over long time horizons, productive farmland appreciates. It's not complicated. Housing appreciated 1,671%, partly because of genuine demand, people need shelter, but also because housing became a speculative asset class financialized through mortgage-backed securities and treated as an investment vehicle rather than just shelter. That speculation adds volatility. Farmland has less of that speculative overlay. It's harder to trade, less liquid. And because of that, it's actually a more stable store of value over time. Here's a hard truth that might sting a little. The advice you've been given about wealth building was designed for an economic system that no longer exists. Work hard, save money, buy a house. That worked when the dollar was backed by gold and the money supply was constrained. It works less well when the money supply can expand infinitely and asset prices rise faster than wages. The system changed. The advice didn't update. Now let me tie all of this together, because when you see how these pieces connect, everything changes. Housing and farmland are both real assets. They both appreciated significantly since 1970. They both outpaced inflation, but they did so through different mechanisms and with different risk profiles. Housing became increasingly financialized, accessible through leverage to ordinary people, and subject to boom-bust cycles driven by monetary policy and speculation. Farmland remained primarily a productive asset, less accessible to ordinary investors but more stable and more directly tied to fundamental economic need. The lesson isn't that you should sell your house and buy farmland. For most people, that's neither practical nor advisable. The lesson is that the narrative around wealth building in America is incomplete. Home ownership is one path. It's not the only path. And it's not necessarily the best path for everyone, especially at today's valuations relative to median income. The deeper lesson is about understanding what actually preserves purchasing power in a fiat currency system. Real assets. Productive assets. Things that generate cash flow or have intrinsic value independent of monetary policy. We're in the home stretch, and I've saved something important for the end. Because this isn't just a history lesson about asset prices, this is about what you do next. Since 1971, when the dollar became purely fiat, the game changed. The old rules don't work. Saving cash doesn't work because cash devalues at 3 to 4% per year minimum, and sometimes much faster during high inflation periods. The people who built wealth over the past 50 years did so by owning assets, stocks, real estate, businesses, farmland, commodities. Things that rise in nominal value as the currency devalues. The people who stayed in cash or relied solely on wage income saw their purchasing power eroded decade after decade. Your grandparents could afford a house because the math worked. 3 times annual income. Wages that kept pace with housing costs. A mortgage paid off in 15 to 20 years. That math is gone. Housing costs 5 to 6 times annual income now. Wages haven't kept pace. Mortgages stretch to 30 years. The affordability crisis isn't in your head. It's in the data. The Census Bureau documents it. The Federal Reserve tracks it. Visual Capitalist charts it. It's real. But here's what matters more. Complaining about the broken system doesn't build wealth. Understanding how the system actually works does. And the system rewards asset ownership. Farmland outperformed housing by 450 percentage points over 55 years because it's a scarce, productive, real asset with inelastic demand. Housing appreciated 1,671% because it's a real asset that everyone needs and the monetary expansion inflates. Both beat cash by enormous margins. Both preserved purchasing power. Both made their owners wealthier in real terms. The question for you is, what assets are you accumulating right now? Are you trading your labor for currency and then storing that currency in a checking account where it loses value daily? Or are you converting your labor into assets that appreciate faster than the currency devalues? That's the game. That's what wealthy people understand and what the conventional advice doesn't tell you clearly enough. There's a reason Bill Gates owns hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland. There's a reason pension funds and university endowments allocate to real assets. There's a reason the wealthy obsess over asset allocation and the middle class obsesses over budgeting. Because budgeting is rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic if the currency you're budgeting is losing value faster than you can save it. Asset allocation is building a lifeboat. Different game entirely. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. You wanted to hear that if you just save harder and cut more expenses, you'll be able to afford what your parents could afford. But that's not true, not anymore. The monetary system changed. Asset prices disconnected from wages. The math that worked in 1970 doesn't work in 2025. And pretending otherwise keeps you stuck running on a treadmill that's accelerating while you're trying to keep pace. Here's the empowering part. You can't change the monetary system. You can't go back to the gold standard. You can't make housing affordable again through force of will. But you can change your strategy. You can start thinking like an asset owner instead of a wage earner who's trying to save enough depreciating currency to someday buy an appreciating asset. You can start small. Index funds, real estate investment trusts, dividend-paying stocks, fractional ownership platforms for farmland if you want exposure to that asset class. None of these require being wealthy to start. They require understanding the game you're actually playing. Housing appreciated 1,671%. Farmland appreciated 2,119%. Both left cash in the dust. Both rewarded people who owned them 50 years ago. The question is, what are you going to own for the next 50 years? Because that decision matters more than how hard you work or how much you save. The system rewards ownership now, not labor, not thrift, ownership. What topic do you want me to break down next? Real estate investment trusts versus direct property ownership. How the Federal Reserve's balance sheet affects your grocery bill. The real math on whether renting or buying makes sense in today's market? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. This channel exists because you keep showing up and asking better questions. Your future wealthier self is counting on you to stop thinking like a budgeter and start thinking like an asset allocator. 10 years from now, you'll look back at this moment and realize it was when you finally understood why your grandparents could afford a house and you can't. Not because the world is unfair, though it often is, but because the monetary rules changed and nobody updated the playbook they handed you. Now you know. The question is what you do with that knowledge. The person you're becoming starts with the assets you start acquiring today. Your parents bought a house for 3 times their annual income and built wealth. You're looking at 6 times your income for the same goal. The game changed. Play the new game. Own assets. Protect your purchasing power. Build real wealth. That's how you win when the currency itself is the thing that's losing.